The Whispering Forest. Elias had always been drawn to the unknown. As a journalist for a small-town newspaper, he made a living chasing eerie stories, uncovering local myths, and debunking urban legends. But nothing prepared him for the horror he would uncover in the Whispering Forest. Located on the outskirts of Ravenwood, the Whispering Forest was notorious. Legends spoke of eerie murmurs at night, of people disappearing within its thick, gnarled trees, never to be seen again. Villagers whispered that the trees themselves breathed, their bark etched with faces contorted in eternal agony. No one ventured into the forest after dusk. Elias, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. On the night of October 13th, he packed his camera, recorder, and flashlight, determined to spend a few hours documenting the eerie woodland. As he crossed the threshold into the dark forest, a shiver crawled down his spine. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of decay. The deeper he walked, the more unnatural the silence became. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled. The absence of sound gnawed at his nerves. He turned on his recorder. This is Elias Carter, reporting live from the Whispering Forest. The air feels heavier than I expected. There's an odd smell, almost metallic. A whisper. Elias froze. He replayed the recording. An odd smell, almost metallic. A whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. A breathy, distorted voice murmuring something just beneath his own words. He scanned the darkness around him, but saw nothing. Shrugging it off as a trick of the wind, he pressed on, deeper into the forest. His flashlight flickered. Then he saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, twisted in agony, staring back at him from the bark of the trees. Some had hollowed-out eyes, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Others had jagged, torn features, as if something had scratched and twisted them into the wood. His breath hitched. He took a step back, his foot sinking into something soft. He looked down. A skeletal hand jutted from the dirt, fingers clawing toward the sky. Then the whispers grew louder. They came from every direction, overlapping, incomprehensible. He felt something behind him, breathing against his neck. He turned. Nothing. The whispers escalated into guttural moans. His flashlight died completely. Heart pounding, Elias fumbled with his camera, hoping for the flash to illuminate his surroundings. He pressed the shutter. A burst of white light, and then, a figure, tall with elongated limbs. Its face was a blur of shifting features, mouths forming and disappearing, eyes blinking from nowhere. It lurched toward him, its arms stretching unnaturally, fingers curling like claws. Elias ran. He didn't know which way he was going, only that he needed to escape. The whispers chased him, voices screeching his name. He tripped over something, bones scattered in the underbrush. Crawling, scrambling. He saw a dim light ahead, the edge of the forest. He burst out into the open and collapsed, gasping for air. The whispers stopped. The weight of unseen eyes vanished. Elias turned back. The forest was still, dark, silent. He scrambled to his feet and ran all the way back to his car. His hands shook as he started the engine, peeling away from the nightmare he had just escaped. Days later, he developed the photographs from that night. Most were blurry, nothing but streaks of darkness. But one sent a chill down his spine. It was the last photo he had taken. A pale, gaping face, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, eyes like empty pits, staring directly at the camera. And behind it, hundreds more. Elias never spoke of what he saw that night. He moved away from Ravenwood, never writing about the Whispering Forest. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake up gasping, heart pounding, because he could still hear the whispers. And sometimes he swore he saw faces in the walls. Then one night it got worse. Elias woke to find his bedroom window wide open. Cold air seeped in, carrying a faint, almost familiar whisper. His heart hammered as he approached the window, peering out into the darkness. First there was nothing, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw movement. A figure, the same elongated limbs, the same shifting face. It stood just beyond the treeline, motionless, watching. Elias stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The sound echoed in the silent room. He grabbed his phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but the signal was dead. The whispers grew louder. Then something moved inside his apartment. His reflection in the mirror twisted, a shadow curling away from it like smoke. The faces he had seen in the trees now pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. The whispers turned to shrieks. Elias ran for the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. The walls trembled, the faces bulging from the paint, their eyes bleeding black liquid. A hand shot out from the mirror, skeletal and elongated, fingers wrapping around his wrist. He screamed as he was pulled forward. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was his own face, reflected in the mirror, twisted, pale and whispering. No one ever saw Elias again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, if you listen closely near the edge of the whispering forest, you might hear the faintest voice calling your name. And if you turn too quickly, you might just see his face staring back at you from the trees. Ravenwood had nearly forgotten Elias Carter. It had been 5 years since his disappearance. His old newspaper office had since closed down, swallowed by the slow decline of the town. The whispering forest remained untouched, a place people spoke of only in hushed tones. But the legend of Elias lingered. Some claimed to have seen him, his silhouette standing at the forest's edge, his voice mingling with the wind. No one dared to investigate, until Daniel Mercer arrived. A documentary filmmaker obsessed with unsolved mysteries. Daniel had read about Elias's disappearance in a dusty archive. Something about the case felt wrong. No body, no leads, no official search beyond a half-hearted sheriff's report. Just a town willing to forget. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in truth. Armed with state-of-the-art cameras, motion detectors, and thermal scanners, he set out to document the whispering forest. His goal was simple: find proof of what happened to Elias Carter. The night of October 13th, exactly 5 years after Elias vanished, Daniel stepped beyond the tree line. The air was thick, unmoving. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No animals, no wind, just a void. He lifted his camera and pressed record. This is Daniel Mercer, investigating the disappearance of journalist Elias Carter. Locals say the whispering forest is cursed. I intend to find out why. Then whispers, faint at first, too quiet to make out. Daniel stopped. His eyes scanned the dark trees. Something moved, a shadow, deep within the woods, shifting between the trees. His thermal scanner flickered, picking up a cold shape, humanoid but too tall, too thin. He took a step forward. The whispers grew louder. Daniel switched to night vision. The camera cast an eerie green glow over the trees. And then, a face, twisted, pale, eyes hollow, mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream. Elias. Daniel staggered backward, his breath catching. The figure stood just a few feet away, watching him. The whispers turned to wails, the air thick with voices, screaming, pleading, calling his name. Then Elias moved. His limbs stretched, bending unnaturally. His face flickered, morphing, shifting between agony and hunger. Daniel turned to run. The forest came alive. Hands clawed from the ground. Faces pressed against the trees, their mouths moving in silent wails. The whispers grew deafening, drilling into his skull. Then Daniel's camera glitched. The screen warped, distorted. A final frame flashed before it went black. Elias, standing inches from the lens, his lips moving. One whisper clear at last. Join us. The camera was found at the forest's edge the next morning. Daniel Mercer was never seen again. But now, 2 voices whisper in the wind. And if you stand at the edge of the whispering forest on October 13th, you might hear them calling. Calling you. The town of Ravenwood was used to disappearances. No one spoke of Daniel Mercer, just as they had erased Elias Carter from their memories. His camera had been found, yes, but not by the authorities. It had been discovered by Nathan Hale, a drifter passing through town, looking for work. The locals warned him about the forest, about the things that moved within the trees. But Nathan wasn't the kind to believe in ghost stories. That was before he watched the footage. The video played in glitchy, distorted bursts. Daniel's voice, shaky but confident. "This is Daniel Mercer, investigating the disappearance of journalist Elias Carter." Then the static began. At first it was subtle, a warping of the frame and occasional flicker. But then the voices started. "IEL. Help me. Behind you." The screen twisted, the colors bleeding. Daniel's breathing turned ragged. The camera flickered. His face appeared on screen, wide-eyed, terror-stricken. Then, behind him, a shadow. No, a face. A dozen faces. Stretched along the trees, mouths gaping in silent screams. And then, the worst part, Daniel turned to run. But before he moved, a hand, long, jagged, inhuman, reached from the darkness and grabbed his shoulder. The screen cut to black. Then one last image. A single frame. A mouth inches from the lens. Grinning. And whispering. "You're next." The video ended. Nathan threw the camera across the room. His breath was ragged. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then a sound. A soft, wet whisper. Right behind him. Nathan spun around. Nothing. Just the dark, empty motel room. But something was wrong. His reflection in the TV screen was smiling. Nathan wasn't. The motel room, the air in the room grew thick, pressed against him, suffocating, pulsing like it was alive. The walls rippled. The faces from the video pressed through the paint, their mouths moving, moaning. Nathan stumbled back, reaching for the door. Locked. The whispers swelled into a shrill, ear-piercing screech. His shadow moved on its own, stretching toward the walls, merging with the figures. His reflection in the window tilted its head, watching, grinning. Then the lights flickered, and he wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, something crouched. Not standing, not human. Its limbs were too long. Its fingers, broken and jagged, tapped against the floor. It grinned. A mouth that stretched too wide, filled with teeth like needles. Nathan couldn't breathe. The thing moved, unfolding too fast, too unnatural. It scuttled toward him on all fours, its bones cracking with every movement. The whispers turned into a roar. Nathan screamed. The lights died. Darkness swallowed him whole. The town of Ravenwood. Nathan's motel room was found abandoned. The door was locked from the inside. The walls were covered in handprints, but the fingers were too long. The bed was untouched. His belongings still there. But Nathan Hale was gone. No sign of a struggle. Just one thing left behind. Daniel Mercer's camera. Still recording. Still whispering. The forest calls again. Days later, Mara Kingsley, a local sheriff's deputy, was tasked with cataloging Nathan's disappearance. Unlike the others in town, she wasn't afraid of the whispering forest. She had grown up hearing the stories. She had seen the things that moved beyond the trees as a child. And she knew it wasn't over. Mara pressed play on the footage. The screen flickered. Static. Then Nathan's motel room. Dark. Distorted. And then his voice. "No. No, please." A blur of motion. A shadow. And then a face filled the screen. Not Nathan's. Not Elias's. Something else. A shifting, writhing thing. Mouths forming and disappearing. Eyes, too many eyes, opening and closing. And then, it spoke. It knew her name. "Mara Kingsley. It's your turn." The lights in the sheriff's office cut out. The screen of the monitor reflected her face. But it wasn't her face. It was smiling. And behind her, in the darkness, a whisper, a breath, a hand reaching out. The screen glitched. Static. Then, one last message appeared on the screen. "The forest doesn't let them go." The legend of the whispering forest continues. The disappearances grow. The whispers spread. And now, if you listen closely, you might hear them calling your name. Turn around slowly. Check your reflection. Because if you see your face smiling back at you when you're not, it's already too late. Ravenwood was dying. The town had always been small, a quiet place people forgot about. But now it was something else. Something wrong. People weren't just disappearing. They were changing. It started subtly. A cashier at the gas station staring too long at her own reflection, lips moving though she never spoke. A child found in his backyard, standing in the rain, whispering to the trees. A local farmer waking up to find his own face staring at him from the wall. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. The forest was spreading. Mara Kingsley didn't sleep anymore. Not since the video. She had watched it too many times. She had heard her name whispered over and over. And each night, she felt something watching her from the dark corners of her house. The lights would flicker. The walls would move. And worst of all, her reflection wasn't always hers anymore. One night, the whispers grew unbearable. Mara Kingsley, come home. The voice came from inside the mirror. And then her reflection moved on its own. It lifted a hand, pressing against the glass. Mara didn't. Her chest tightened. Then the reflection smiled. And it stepped out. Mara staggered back, hitting the dresser. The thing that had once been her emerged from the mirror, the glass rippling like water. It wasn't human. Its eyes were too dark. Its mouth was too wide. Its limbs too long. It whispered her name. And then it ran at her. Mara fired her gun. The sound shattered the air. But the thing didn't stop. It was on her, its fingers curling around her throat. But the skin wasn't skin, it was cold, wet, like something pulled from the earth. Then it spoke in her own voice. The forest is waiting, Mara. Everything went black. Mara woke up in the woods. The air was thick with mist, and the trees were wrong. Their bark pulsed like living flesh, and the faces were closer now. She could see their eyes moving, see their lips twitching as if whispering words they could no longer speak. Then, a sound behind her. A snap. Mara turned, and she saw them. Not just Elias. Not just Daniel. Hundreds. Figures trapped between the trees, merged into the roots, buried in the earth. Their faces warped and shifting, eyes hollow, mouths stretched in endless silent screams. And behind them, something bigger. Something that crawled. Its limbs too many. Its body shifting. Its mouth opening into a pit of endless teeth. The forest wasn't just alive. It was hungry. Mara tried to run, but the ground wasn't ground anymore. It was hands, reaching, grabbing, pulling her down. The trees groaned, whispering her name, and the air felt thick with unseen bodies moving just beyond her vision. Then, she felt it. A hand on her shoulder. She turned. Elias was there, inches from her face. But his eyes were empty pits. And his mouth was moving. And then he spoke. You should have never watched the tape. And everything collapsed. Mara woke up in her bed. Her hands were clean. No blood. No dirt. Had it been a nightmare? Then she saw the mirror. Her reflection stood still. But it wasn't Mara. It was grinning. And then, the whispers started inside her head. Not outside. Inside. Welcome home, Mara. The forest was inside her now. And there was no escape. The town of Ravenwood is quiet again. The disappearances have stopped. But now, people have started whispering in their sleep. Their reflections don't always move when they do. And if you walk too close to the edge of the whispering forest, you might see someone familiar standing just inside the tree line, watching, waiting, and whispering your name. Ravenwood was no longer just a town. It was a hunting ground. The people who remained had stopped talking. Their lips moved in silent whispers, their eyes darting to dark corners where things shifted in the shadows. Mara Kingsley knew she was running out of time. The forest was inside her now. She could hear it breathing, feel its roots curling through her veins, pulling her toward something deep beneath the earth. But she wasn't going to let it take her. Not without a fight. Mara had one chance. She packed her car with gasoline, her father's old hunting rifle, and the only thing that might make a difference, Elias Carter's last photograph. The one with the pale, gaping face staring back at the camera. If the forest wanted her, she would bring the fire to it first. She drove like a madwoman through Ravenwood's empty streets, the streetlights flickering as if trying to warn her. When she reached the edge of the whispering forest, the wind died completely. The silence was alive. And then, a figure stood in the road. Tall, unnatural, its mouth twisted and opened, stretching wider and wider until it was nothing but darkness. The moment Mara saw it, she understood. This was no creature. This was the forest itself. The trees groaned. The whispers became screams. The thing moved toward her, its limbs unfolding, its fingers reaching. Mara hit the gas. The car slammed into the figure, but it didn't break. It didn't even move. It simply absorbed the impact, and Mara felt something cold and wet crawl across her skin. Hands. So many hands. Grabbing. Dragging. She screamed as the windshield cracked open like a mouth, the glass stretching into teeth. The car wasn't a car anymore. It was becoming part of the forest. The whispers poured into her skull, filling every inch of her mind. Stay with us, Mara. Join us. Become us. And then, a voice. A single, familiar voice. Run. Elias. Mara snapped back, ripping herself free. She rolled out of the car, hitting the dirt, gasping. The figure loomed above her, its face splitting into endless screaming mouths. But Mara wasn't done yet. With shaking hands, she grabbed the gasoline canister from the trunk. She drenched the ground around her, her fingers trembling as she struck a match. The creature reached for her. She dropped the match. Fire erupted. The whispers turned into screeches of agony, inhuman and deafening. The flames licked at the trees, and for the first time in centuries, the whispering forest screamed. Faces in the bark twisted in agony. The trees split open, their insides not wood but flesh. The sky turned black. Something massive moved beneath the earth, shifting, writhing. And then, it began to rise. Mara ran. Behind her, the forest was coming undone. The trees twisted into nightmarish shapes, faces melting into pools of ink, the whispers turning into howls of rage. She made it to the edge of town just as the ground split open behind her. A shape so massive it blocked out the sky began to pull itself free from the earth. She could barely comprehend it. A being made of shadows, flesh, and endless mouths. Its body filled with the souls of the lost, their faces screaming in silent agony. The thing that had been feeding on Ravenwood for centuries. It was waking up. Mara didn't look back. She reached the town limits, gasping, stumbling onto the highway, and then the forest collapsed in on itself. The trees withered to dust. The whispers were silenced. And the thing that had been buried beneath Ravenwood for eons let out one last, deafening roar, before it vanished forever. Epilogue. The last whisper. The town of Ravenwood ceased to exist. Within days, every house, every street, every trace of its existence was gone. No maps recorded it. No one remembered it, except Mara Kingsley. She left that night never looking back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she still wakes up gasping because she hears it. A whisper, faint, almost silent, calling her name. And when she looks in the mirror, sometimes her reflection is still smiling. The end.